75. Use prostitution as a way of making ends meet. While some women worked regularly as prostitutes, many others used occasional prostitution to fill the gaps in their meager incomes. When Edna O'Neill and Bob Armstrong exchanged a series of letters in 1912, they expressed their love and longing for each other. She was in Vancouver, British Columbia, and he was in Seattle, and they looked forward to when they could be together again. She wrote to Bob that when she was having trouble paying her expenses, she turned a trick for $5.20, although there is no suggestion that Bob Armstrong coerced her into doing that. They apparently had an understanding that turning tricks was a viable way of making ends meet. Rather than Armstrong paying for her transportation, she wrote to him about her sending him money so that he could come join her. In spite of that, Bob was convicted of enticing her to come from Seattle to Vancouver for prostitution and the purpose of concubinage with him, and was sentenced to 2 years in the state penitentiary. These stories show working women in both their vulnerability to economic forces and in their determination to pursue their lives and loves in spite of their poverty. Many early 20th century social reformers argued that economic forces were some of the primary factors holding women in bondage as prostitutes and white slaves. Recall that reformer Clara Laughlin had determined that women needed a bare minimum of $8 per week to live independently, but that most working women made only $4 or $5 per week. 21 These limited options for women's work clarify the choices. 76. Facing women like Edna O'Neill, her letters suggested that she was neither a white slave nor a career prostitute, but rather occupied a space in the middle, in which turning one trick for $5 made a whole week's worth of wages. Many of the female victims in Mann Act cases were not, however, commercial sex workers. These women were the apparently voluntary, and often long-term lovers of men to whom they were not married. The involvement of women like Emma Robinson in Mann Act prosecutions blurred the distinction between consent and coercion, and called into question the categories of victim and victimizer. For some women, the status of victim allowed them an opportunity for legal action through allegations of Mann Act violations. For other women, their words and actions defied this definition of victimization. The primarily working-class women who found themselves caught up in these cases acted in a variety of ways that refined and challenged legal understandings of the specific conditions in which men sexually exploited women. Through either working with the legal system or against it, women found various ways to shape the Mann Act to their own ends, thereby subverting both the narratives of reformers and the legal construction of victimization embedded in the Mann Act. Mobilizing victimization. On December 9, 1913, the Los Angeles Police Department received a letter from Bertha Lake requesting a little protection and declaring her the queen of the white slaves. 22 The police chief, who received Lake's plea for help, certainly would have 77 recognized the significance of this language, since the white slavery scare was then at its peak. Typically, white slave narratives evoked an image of a naive, young white girl lured to a big city by a predatory male, then deprived of her virtue through force, and left to a life of shame and disease in a brothel. Bertha Lake's account, however, differed significantly from those white slave tales, while simultaneously drawing on the recently established legal authority of the Mann White Slave Traffic Act. Lake invoked the language of white slavery to demand that the law assist and avenge her when her lover refused to marry her. Though the Mann Act characterized women as passive victims, incapable of consent, women throughout the United States, like Bertha Lake, found ways to use the law for their own purposes. Why did Bertha Lake designate herself a white slave, despite the fact that she had willingly moved into the home of her lover, Robert Sibok? An analysis of Lake's statements, and those of other women, reveals that some women in Mann Act cases relied on accepted ideas about the victimization of women in order to maneuver themselves within the legal system. In particular, these women sought to punish their wayward lovers, get themselves out of trouble, or both. The women who used Mann Act prosecutions in an attempt to redress their grievances faced a legal system in which women had little power. They did not serve on juries and were almost never police officers, FBI agents, lawyers, judges, or legislators. These women used the power of their narratives to make bargains across class and gender lines. In exchange for the protection of the law, they offered their compliance with white middle-class norms and gave their national Arc 78 assent to a law that limited their sexual freedom. 23. Bertha Lake addressed her letter to the chief of police and requested a little protection. She explained that the man with whom she was living, Robert Sibok, wanted her to be his mistress instead of marrying her, and that she was a good girl who did not want to live an honest life. Through this language, Lake identified herself with the moral standards of the middle class, thereby establishing herself an innocent victim despite her complicity in the situation. She asserted that she desired to work if she could find a job, but wrote that since she had just traveled to Los Angeles from Providence, Rhode Island, she did not yet know her way around California. Having made no allegations against Robert Sibok other than that he would not marry her, she signed this plea for help with her name and self-assigned title, Queen of the White Slaves. 24. When the Los Angeles Police Department received Bertha's plea for help in 1913, those familiar with the narratives of white slavery probably expected this letter to contain an account of brutal victimization, particularly a drugging, kidnapping, beating, or rape, since these were the alleged instruments of white slavers in their quest to conquer. 2379. And exploit young women. Bertha's narrative, however, did not replicate these popular storylines. Indeed, it did not even resemble them, except for the final claim to enslavement. Her letter illustrates the relationship between popular and legal understandings of victimization. Lake seized the power of federal legislation and, presumably, the sympathy of the Los Angeles Police Department when she situated herself within the framework of white slave narratives. Bertha's letter to the Los Angeles police chief drew on her understanding that white slaves were women who had been sexually victimized by men, though she entirely neglected the commercial aspect of standard white slavery narratives. Her letter instead relied on expectations for manhood and lawful sexual behavior that, unfulfilled, enabled her to use the Mann Act to both punish Robert and reclaim her virtue and respectability. Her letter said, "Dear sir, being a stranger in a strange land, I am very sad and would like to call on you for a little protection, as I have made a big mistake in coming here 2 weeks ago. I came to Los Angeles to be a bride. As I got off the train, of course, I had written and told him I wanted to be married as soon as I got here. Instead, he wants me to be his mistress. I am a good girl and do not consider it my duty now. What I wish to ask such, and in such an unlawful way, I am not accustomed to the bylaws of California, and wish very much for advice. Will you be so kind as to answer my questions, as he has been so unmanly as to make me believe in this mode of living. I am willing to work for myself, but do not know how to go around in this place. I can do any kind of work, and will not live an honest life. Please tell me what to do. I am an ever heartbroken girl from the East. I am from Providence. R.I. Hoping for a good reply. I am respectfully, Miss Bertha Lake, Queen of the White Slaves, number 1774 East 43rd Street, Los Angeles, Cal 2580. Bertha's cry for help seems at first more an admission of her own folly than a claim of victimization. After all, she admitted that she made a big mistake when she decided to get on the train to Los Angeles. Her primary complaint against Robert was that he'd been unmanly by obliging her to live in an unlawful way and to lead an honest life. And how, exactly, had he kept her captive as his white slave? By refusing to get married and making Bertha believe in this mode of living. Bertha appropriated the language of white slavery in an instance that, contrary to the white slavery narratives of social reformers, apparently included no physical captivity or commercial sexual exploitation. Instead, Bertha drew on the long tradition, hashed out during seduction cases, of viewing a false promise of marriage as a form of coercion. Although no transcripts of testimony exist in the case against Robert Sibok, the letters that were admitted into evidence give some sense of why Bertha chose to make this appeal to the police. 26 Bertha's claim to white slavery seems to be both an attempt at punishing Robert Sibok with whom she was apparently no longer in love, and a way of saving herself from the poverty and stigma that could accompany a woman in her position. In either case, Bertha used the language of victimization, clearly learned from the widespread and popular narratives about white slavery, to actively seek punishment for the man she felt had betrayed her. 27, 26, 81. This story ended with imprisonment, but began with romance. A series of letters, which were admitted into evidence, outline the emotions, expectations, and plans of both Robert and Bertha. 28. Bertha's long and frequent letters to Robert are marked with all the signs of a young woman's infatuation. The first two letters in the file from her, dated October 22nd and 29th, 1913, include her improvised love poems at the end. Lines such as, "The roses are red / the violets blue / the pinks are sweet / and so are you / if you love me / as I love you / no knife can cut our love in two" start to hint at what would end in a Mann Act prosecution. Only weeks later, Bertha's profound disillusionment when she came to believe that her own dear boy Robert did not love her as she loved him. 29. In these letters, Bertha wrote of her love for Robert and her hope that they would be together soon and that she would be his wife. She wrote that her mother sends her love to you and says she hopes someday that she will have the pleasure of calling you her son, for she likes your letters and your picture, and she know you will make a good husband to any girl that is good to you. 30. Bertha's inclusion of her mother in her and writing single pregnancy in the post-war United States. American Historical Review 100, December 1982. Plans to marry Robert made this case very different from the white slave narratives, in which naive country girls were lured away from their families. For example, in Reginald Kaufman's anti-white slavery novel, The House of Bondage, the young victim neither tells her family when she leaves with a man, nor is allowed to return home afterward. 31. Though Bertha's next letter scolded Robert for not writing to her, it also catalogued her wedding preparations. She sent Robert sleeve garters for his birthday and promised to make more for him soon. She planned to make sheets and pillowcases and stand covers and bearer scarfs. "I am sewing all the time. My mother is going to make me a silk dress to be married in. It is fine. I wish you could see it now." 32. She asked him to let her know how many windows were in his cottage so she could begin making curtains. Bertha's letters reveal her in a flurry of activity and anticipation as she imagined getting married soon. There were, however, some practical matters to be considered. Bertha lived in Rhode Island and Robert in California. Despite the apparent support of Bertha's mother, she did not have the money to travel to California on her own, and anxiously reminded Robert, "You say you have got some money saved up. I have not got any now. I am a poor girl myself." 33. The economic dependency of women was central to the Mann Act. Though women were expected to be dependents within marriage, it was a felony when men provided interstate transportation for women to whom they were not married, but with whom they cohabitated. 31. Reginald. 83. Robert responded immediately to Bertha's assertion of her poverty with an anxiety-laden account of his finances and work situation. Explaining that he recently lost his job and would have to drain his savings to pay his bills, he promised that as soon as he got another job he would send Bertha a ticket to California. He wrote that, once Bertha was in California, if he could secure a good work so as to pay all of our expenses and save a little beside, then we are going to be married. 34. This letter suggests what, it seems, came to pass, that Bertha and Robert would not be married immediately upon her arrival. Robert did indeed find the money to send Bertha a ticket in November, and after her mother hosted a wedding shower for her, she boarded a train to Los Angeles on the 20th. By November 27th, Bertha seemed happily settled into her home with Robert. On that date, she wrote a Thanksgiving letter to Robert's parents, in which she addressed them as dearest mother and father, and explained that she was very happy to be Robert's wife, as he was the best husband in the world, and we both love each other very much, then signed her name Mrs. Robert B. Sibick. 35. What happened in less than 2 weeks to take Bertha from Mrs. Sibick to Queen of the White Slaves? Given this series of letters, it seems most likely that Bertha became disillusioned when the two did not wed as quickly as she had expected. Perhaps, also, the strain on Robert's finances that did not allow for their marriage also made Bertha reconsider her options. Clearly, Bertha originally intended to be Robert's wife, even a few days after her arrival when, while living with him, she claimed to his parents that they were 34 married is bold in the original. USV 84. Married. But was disillusionment really enough of a reason to press Mann Act charges? For some women, it was. Newspaper reports from the 1910s and 1920s have numerous accounts of women who punished ex-lovers and wayward husbands by using the Mann Act against them. In this case, Lake's claim to victimization also served an added purpose. It was a way of demanding aid from the police department. By casting herself in her letter to the police as a penniless, jobless, hopeless girl from the East Coast, but one who desired to live a virtuous life, she secured the help of the city. Indeed, the subpoenas in the court records show Bertha to have been in the care of police matron Nellie Tarbell by the time of the proceedings. After Bertha's plea for help, Robert was indicted on charges of knowingly persuading, inducing, enticing, and coercing Bertha Lake to go from one place to another in interstate commerce, for the purposes of prostitution, debauchery, and for an immoral purpose, namely, to cohabit with the said Bertha Lake without being married to her. On March 12, 1914, the jury found him guilty of these charges, and he received the relatively light sentence of 3 months in the Los Angeles County Jail. 36 with her claim to victimization, made particularly through her, Ms. appropriation of the term white slave, Bertha brought to her aid federal law as well as local police officers. This was a new sort of white slave tale, in which the victim ultimately used the power of her narrative to imprison the alleged violator. Bertha Lake was just one of hundreds, perhaps even thousands, of women who used the Mann Act to seek retribution for their perceived victimization. As part of their 36th and 85 negotiation with the legal system, women played up the parts of their stories that appealed to middle-class sensibilities. Hence Bertha emphasized her moral goodness and her desire, most likely genuine, for a marriage and the trappings of a respectable, middle-class life. Bertha's narrative reinforced the idea that women needed special protection from the courts, but simultaneously undermined that notion by actively demanding that the law assist her and prosecute Robert. Celia Frances Trindle also wrote a letter begging for help, this time to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Like Bertha Lake, Celia was a poor woman who sought the aid of the Mann Act both to punish a man and to make her future more economically secure. In the summer of 1918, Celia and her husband, Bert, separated and stopped living together. They were still legally married, and Bert agreed to send her $50 a month to support her. He continued to do this as he moved throughout Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia, traveling and living with another woman and her son. However, 2 years later the payments stopped, and an irate Celia turned to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Celia wrote to the FBI pleading for their help and asking if there was no way a woman can get her rights, and if there was no hopes, for a truthful woman. Celia, like Bertha, emphasized her own morality in contrast to that of her husband. She argued that because he took his mistress across state lines, he had violated the Mann Act, and therefore it was the responsibility of the FBI to locate and apprehend him. What is telling about this case, however, is that Celia's primary motivation was financial, rather than moral. She had no objections to her husband's travel until he stopped paying her $50 a month. By invoking the Mann Act, Celia not only tried 86 to force her husband to pay her monthly allowance, she also sought to have him convicted of a felony and, presumably, sent to prison. Like many other abandoned lovers in the 1910s and 1920s, Celia took advantage of this law when she wrote to the FBI, asserting, "Now I do not know what more I should tell you, but I know they ought to be punished," italics added. 37. While some women claimed that they were victims in order to punish wayward lovers and establish their own moral purity as innocent victims, other women used similar narratives in an attempt to escape charges themselves. In a prominent 1912 case in Seattle, an admitted prostitute, was charged with transporting another prostitute from Vancouver to Seattle. Although Florence Hazel Moore was the defendant, she argued that she was a victim of the same social and economic forces that turned other women into prostitutes and white slaves. After her arrest, Moore fought back by writing her life story for publication in the Seattle Star newspaper. Entitled My Confession, this 4-page account portrays Moore as the victim, rather than the villain. It provides a fascinating look into the life of a woman who experienced multiple hardships and ultimately turned to prostitution, but its greater significance lies in its parallels to the narratives written by social reformers about the social ills that put women at risk for exploitation, sexual and otherwise. Framed as a frank appeal for sympathy and a square deal, Moore's confession told a story that had begun to sound familiar, at least to social reformers, by the second. 87. Decade of the 20th century. 38 Moore told of her sheltered, rural upbringing in a convent and her sudden marriage at the age of 14. These two teenagers from Kentucky were wild to see life, sick, and so ran off to that place of wonders, New York City. Moore's husband soon fell ill with tuberculosis, and, left alone with a baby, she found work as an actress in the musical theater industry. After she had been through the mill, Moore wrote that the scales fell from my eyes. I saw life as it is. But there was no going back. The convent child was dead. The showgirl had her way to make, 39. Describing tragedy after tragedy, Moore attempted to explain her descent into prostitution to the newspaper's audience. On a traveling theater tour that stopped in Seattle, Moore fell ill and was left behind at the hospital. Now alone and penniless in a strange city, she was befriended by a woman who paid Moore's hospital bills and then took her to the brothel she ran. Moore cast some blame for this situation on the citizens of Seattle when she expressed that if, instead, a woman from above the line had befriended me, I might not now be the notorious Hazel Moore, 40. She also offered another reason for her life as a prostitute. It was that or starve. 41 Moore then became the mistress of a wealthy, married man who showered her with good food, fine gowns, diamonds, and automobiles to ride in. 42 When this man went to prison for a crime not named in the newspaper story, Moore returned to prostitution and made the fateful trip to and from Vancouver with a fellow prostitute that resulted in her arrest for violating the Mann Act. 88. Though Moore was the one accused of violating the Mann Act, her story bore much greater resemblance to the stories about white slaves than to the descriptions of the villains who enslaved them. As legal scholar Marlene Beckman, whose work analyzed cases in which women were convicted of conspiracy to violate the Mann Act, argued, in reality, the female violators of the Mann Act were victims of their own hard lives and the morals of the time. 43 Hazel Moore's tale aimed to elicit sympathy from an audience that was most likely familiar with Stephen Crane's Maggie, A Girl of the Streets, Theodore Dreiser's Sister Carrie, or Reginald Kaufman's The House of Bondage. Moore's story contained various elements similar to these works of literature, from the rural upbringing, to the corruption of the big city, to the powerful social and economic forces that led a desperate woman astray. By situating herself as a victim in this article, Moore called into question the whole premise of the Mann Act. If women like her were dragged down into prostitution by forces beyond their control, why then were they prosecuted by the very law designed to protect them? In Moore's case, her appeal to the public seems to have worked. She was eventually found not guilty. Portraying female defendants as victims of social and economic forces beyond their control may have been a common line of defense in cases where women were accused of transporting other women. In one set of proposed jury instructions, the defendant's lawyer asserted, "The purpose and object of the statute upon which this prosecution is based is to prevent and break up an infamous traffic in women and girls for immoral purposes." If you believe that the defendant was merely the victim, rather than 89. The procurer and promoter of such traffic, you should return a verdict of not guilty. 44 in Mann Act cases that had both male and female defendants, and both were convicted. Judges in the Pacific Northwest consistently gave more harsh sentences to the male defendants. In 3 such cases, the male defendant received 18 months at the McNeil Island State Penitentiary, while the female defendant received only 53 days in the King County Jail. The male defendant received 13 months at McNeil Island, while the female defendant received 6 months in the King County Jail, and the male defendant received 90 days in jail and a $500 fine, while the female defendant only had to pay the $500 fine. 45 No transcripts exist in these cases, so no one can know what their lawyers argued, but these sentencing discrepancies may demonstrate the success of female defendants' arguments that they, too, were victims. Though some women in Mann Act cases assumed the stance of victims, they were not the helpless girls pictured behind bars in white slavery lore. Rather, they used their alleged victimization to claim the legal power and social retribution afforded them by federal law. In many cases, women reacted to a broken promise of marriage by urging the police and prosecutors to pursue Mann Act charges. Mary Brady, in Chicago, pushed for 4490 Mann Act charges when the man with whom she had been living refused to marry her. 46 Edna Doppler, who had followed her lover from San Francisco to Boston, lived with him while waiting for him to divorce his current wife and marry her. When that did not happen, she sought a Mann Act prosecution, not, as she said, out of spite, but rather because this man refused to keep his promise to marry me or to do the right thing by his own wife. 47 She went on to note that this man had acquired a new girlfriend instead of sticking with her. In another case of retribution by a woman scorned, Mann Act charges were made against William Riddle by his ex-fiancée as soon as she found out that he had married another woman, combined with the subsequent realization by police that William was a suspected New York jewel thief. The new bride was not pleased. 48 The women in these cases may have been victims of men who did not fulfill their promises of marriage, but they were not the young women envisioned drugged or kept behind bars in white slavery novels and films. In the vast majority of cases, there was no allegation that the woman's sexual activity was physically coerced or forced, though she may have been enticed by promises of marriage or by economic opportunities. Nevertheless, many of these women clearly felt disillusioned and abandoned by their male lovers, and sought punishment for them, which in many cases the law subsequently provided. As the previously discussed case of Bertha Lake and Robert Sibick demonstrated, an unfulfilled expectation of marriage could quickly turn a loving wife into the queen of white slaves. 91 The broad language of the Mann Act and the willingness of prosecutors to indict in non-commercial cases gave some women the opportunity to bend the definitions of victimization and immoral purposes to their own ends. Bertha Lake claimed her status as a white slave in an attempt to receive help from the police department, while other women exploited the willingness of the court to disregard the white slavery origins of the law and achieved a sort of inverted power through allegations of victimization. Simultaneously, many other women actively resisted the idea of victimization and asserted that they had willing and consensual affairs with the men accused of immoral purposes. Whether women were forced into the role of victim or chose to claim victimization as a way of gaining power or escaping punishment, the Mann Act created a complicated and contradictory set of legal identities for the women who found themselves caught up in these cases. Resisting victimization. While some women actively claimed victimization, others attempted to resist being defined as victims by police officers and prosecutors. As cases involving consensual, unmarried couples were prosecuted with increasing regularity, by the late 1910s, prosecutors attempted to force women who bore little resemblance to white slaves into the role of victim. Many of these women were clearly willing lovers of the men accused of victimizing them, and most had to be detained so that prosecutors could force them to testify against the defendants. Their stories show a significant departure from the stated intent of the Mann Act, as the FBI and prosecutors sought out cases involving illicit and immoral sexual behavior, rather than forced prostitution. By the 1920s, the vast majority of indictments on the West Coast charged men with coercing women into debauchery, concubinage, cohabitation, or immoral purposes, rather than prostitution. This reflected the growing emphasis on prosecuting men for having consensual affairs, not for being engaged in commercial sex trafficking. One of the primary ways in which women resisted being identified as victims was by attempting to escape testifying against the defendants. Without the victim as the primary witness, prosecutors usually could not get a conviction, and indeed many of the dismissed cases involved victim witnesses who could not be found and subpoenaed. The victims in Mann Act cases were regularly imprisoned as material witnesses in order to force them to testify against the defendants. This long-standing legal tradition is employed when a material witness is uncooperative, or when there is reason to believe that the witness will not show up to trial in response to a subpoena. 49 The detained witness had the opportunity to post bail, but if she could not, as was almost always the case, she was imprisoned until her role in the trial was over. This highly coercive measure was used not only to keep material witnesses within the jurisdiction of the court, but also to force them to cooperate and to punish them for their resistance. This was a regular occurrence for women in Western Mann Act cases. The following example is typical of the arguments made by prosecutors about why the women who were listed in the indictments as victims should be detained. An affidavit from a special agent for the Department of Justice swore that the alleged victim, Lizzie Tito, is a material and competent witness on behalf of the plaintiff in the 49-93 above entitled cause, and unless detained by this court will leave the district, and that it will be impossible to secure her as a witness on the trial of said cause, that the testimony of said witness is necessary to secure a conviction of the defendant above named. 50. The women who resisted cooperating with the prosecution faced this inconvenient, financially difficult, and often humiliating ordeal, in which they were imprisoned much like the men accused of victimizing them. Although they were given the option of bail, it was usually set at a minimum of $1,000, which was far out of reach for working-class women. Women under the age of 18 were usually sent to a juvenile detention facility or a home for unwed mothers while they awaited trial. The court did pay women for the duration of their detention, usually at the rate of $1 per day. However, as Mary Odom has demonstrated regarding age of consent cases, such detentions were often a grueling and punitive experience for women, as police officers interrogated them about the minute details of their sexual histories. 51 These detentions regularly lasted for over a month, as the women were detained for the duration of the court proceedings, and were often only released once the verdict was reached. One female witness's experience illustrates the extremely coercive nature of these detentions. During the pretrial proceedings before a commissioner, the victim refused to answer the questions posed to her. She insisted repeatedly that she wanted to speak with a lawyer, but the prosecutor refused, grilling her with, "Why don't you want to?" 94. Testify? Why don't you want to talk? She reiterated that she had not had an opportunity to speak long enough with an attorney. The commissioner then asked, "You understand you can be punished for your attitude?" After her affirmative response, he said, "Very well, then, Miss Wood, this is probably what will happen to you unless you do testify. You will probably have to go to jail for an indefinite time, if you prefer to do that rather than answer simple questions." When she continued to refuse to cooperate, it was decided that she should, indeed, be committed to the county jail with a bond fixed at $2,500. Faced with her impending imprisonment, she began to answer the questions. 52. Maxine Evans, another victim who was arrested and detained as a witness, filed an affidavit requesting her release. This document offers her reasons for refusing to testify and references the primary reason for women's detention, the effort of prosecutors to coerce them into testifying. Evans swore upon oath and said that she was detained because the prosecutor wanted her to testify, and that she would not do so because it involved privileged matters and her testimony would have a tendency to incriminate her. She claimed that the district attorney said he would continue to detain her so that she would change her mind about testifying for the plaintiff. The affidavit continued, deponent says that she is unable to secure bail for her release, and she believes that it is the purpose of the officers in insisting upon her detention to deprive her of and deny her by coercion of such detention her constitutional privilege of not appearing and testifying to matters of self-incriminating nature. 53 Evans Affidavit. 95. Demonstrates the efforts of prosecutors to force women into the position of victim so that they would testify in court. At the same time, the high rate of women's detention by the court shows that women regularly resisted being identified as victims in these cases. The following two cases offer a glimpse of the kinds of circumstances that could lead a man to be prosecuted and a woman to be detained in Mann Act cases. The female victims in these cases were willing participants in interstate affairs and also occasionally engaged in prostitution. Both of these women had to be kept in jail in order to force them to testify against the men accused of victimizing them. Viola Newman was over 30 years old, hardly the young, naive girl of white slavery lore, and had been living in adultery with J.B. Moore as they traveled throughout the Northwest and British Columbia. She did practice prostitution at the various places they lived, but it is unclear whether that was a constant profession for her or just a way of occasionally making ends meet. The commissioner wrote a statement explaining why he set an unusually high bail for her, because she was the prosecution's primary witness, and he did not believe she would stay in the district and testify if she was not forced to. He described her as a person without moral character and primarily responsible to a great extent for the wrongdoing of the defendant. 54. Nevertheless, when the man Viola had been living with pled guilty and was sentenced to 7 months of hard labor, she became legally defined as a victim, regardless of the true circumstances of their affair. 96. Vernon Goldie and Lucille Goldie exchanged a series of love letters, calling themselves wifey and hubby, and expressing their love, commitment, and desire to be together. Lucille Goldie seemed to have worked as a prostitute on at least a couple of occasions, but was now trying to make an honest living, and he promised her that she'd never have to work again unless she wanted to, but not as a prostitute. When Lucille moved from Portland to join Vernon in Seattle, he was accused of transporting her for the purpose of prostitution, concubinage, debauchery, and immoral purposes. 55. In a rare outcome, Mr. Goldie was found not guilty. These cases are representative of the effort to prosecute cases that were fundamentally about interstate love affairs with little or no commercial motive. In these cases, prosecutors attempted to force women who did not see themselves as victims into that position by imprisoning them when they refused to cooperate with the trial. In spite of all of the cases in which abandoned wives or jilted ex-lovers pressed Mann Act charges, many other women fought them. In 1916, the Los Angeles Times reported that, in a situation that defies convention, 17-year-old Loy Ransford was devastated to have Mann Act charges pressed against her lover. With a baby in one arm and another on the way, she clung to him and kissed him goodbye as he was taken to jail. The fact that he had a wife waiting to testify against him in Indiana may provide a clue as to why charges were pressed. 56. In a 1923 case, an unmarried couple took a cross-country road trip. They quickly wed after their arrest in Wyoming, but Bert Minch was 55. 97. Still indicted for violating the Mann Act. His victim-turned-wife, Mrs. Doris Minch, repeatedly appeared in court demanding that the case be dismissed. 57. As 15-year-old Elsie Mattis said about the married 22-year-old who took her across state lines with him, "Lloyd has always treated me real good. I don't think he did right in getting me to go away with him when he couldn't marry me, but I don't blame him, and I don't want him to be prosecuted." 58. Gladys Allen also fought for the dismissal of Mann Act charges against her husband, in spite of the fact that this was one of the rare situations in which prostitution really does seem to have occurred. Gladys's letters to her husband provide a useful contrast to the letters of Bertha Lake. Gladys's husband was indicted less than 3 months before Bertha wrote to the police chief, and both recorded their own narratives of victimization in their letters. Nevertheless, their stories are vastly different. While Bertha Lake claimed victimization to punish Robert Sibbick, Gladys Allen denied that she had been a victim of her husband and instead tried to use her letters to fight his imprisonment. On September 27, 1913, Martin Allen was indicted for coercing Gladys Allen to go from Los Angeles to Yuma, Arizona for the purpose of engaging in and submitting to prostitution and debauchery, and of living in said state of Arizona in immoral relations with one Charles H. Duvel. 59. Gladys's letters to her imprisoned husband asserted his innocence, but also suggested the truth of the charges involving Charles 57. 98. Duvel. She wrote to Martin reminding him that it is all Charles' fault, and he ought to get all the blame for it, and even broke us up when we could have been happy together, and pleaded with him to get the witnesses to prove that Charlie was the whole doing, as there is so many that know he was the one, and those people one local train going to Yuma asked me if he was my husband, and I wished would have said no, sick. Gladys's letters express longing to be reunited with her husband, and frequent demands that he be released, though she incorrectly assumed that Martin had some control over whether or not that happened. She instructed him to write to the chief of police, or else get your lawyer to get you out right away, hurry, and in another letter, now write right away to the lawyer, and have him release you. After a few months, Martin's case was dismissed, perhaps because of Gladys' lack of cooperation as a witness. Meanwhile, Charles Duvel had pled guilty in the case against him, and had been given the relatively harsh sentence of 4 years at the San Quentin State Penitentiary in California. The women involved in Mann Act prosecutions dealt with the themes of victimization and consent in varied ways. While some women actively claimed to be victims as a way of gaining leverage within a patriarchal legal system, others resisted being defined as victims and were uncooperative with prosecutors. Through active forms of resistance, like the letters or affidavits sent by some women, or more passive forms, like fleeing the jurisdiction before they could be subpoenaed, many women rejected the court's authority to determine for them whether or not they were victims. Meanwhile, the courts found a convoluted way of bridging the gap between the Mann Act's definition of 99 victimization and the overwhelming evidence that many women willingly went along with interstate affairs. The Supreme Court created the legal possibility that women could be tried for conspiring to violate the Mann Act by cooperating in their own victimization. Conspiracy. Conspiracy cases blurred the legal line between victim and perpetrator by making it possible for one woman to be both. During the first few years of Mann Act prosecutions, the courts struggled with how to understand Mann Act cases in which the woman may not have been a legitimate victim, but rather be trying to blackmail a certain man. This was discussed particularly in relation to professional prostitutes, who were already immoral, and therefore might try to make even more money by seducing a man, traveling across state lines with him, and then blackmailing him. In response to this fear, and in recognition of the growing number of consensual affairs passing through the courts, the Supreme Court decided in the 1915 Holt case to allow for the possibility that women could be charged with conspiracy to violate the Mann Act. Within a few years of the 1910 passage of the Mann Act, newspapers were reporting that women, both as individuals and as part of organized crime rings, were blackmailing men who violated the Mann Act. Both the New York Times and San Francisco Chronicle carried stories in 1914 about the arrest in Chicago of a brilliant brunette beauty named Jessie E. Cope, accused of trying to blackmail a wealthy, married capitalist for $50,000 and 60 cents, the belief that the Mann Act was particularly fertile ground for 60 blackmail behind Cope Alexander Mann Act case, San Francisco Chronicle, December 6, 1914, PG 36. See also $50,000 blackmail in Alexander case, New York Times, December 6, 1914, PG 1. 100. Blackmailers became so prevalent that in 1914 newspapers produced a series of articles and editorials condemning it and calling for an amended version of the law. An editorial in the Chicago Daily Tribune offered a scathing response to Representative Mann's resistance to any revision of the Mann Act. It argued that the law had been construed far too broadly and accurately noted that the law had become a tool for regulating various types of sexual behavior, not just white slavery. It is because mistaken reformers wish to make this statute an instrument to punish voluntary, non-commercial sexual offenses that they object to amendment restricting its application strictly to cases of traffic in women, called white slavery. It is the confident opinion of the Tribune that the Supreme Court, at least will restrict the operation of the Mann Act to this field, and will refuse to dump upon the central authority responsibility for correcting the private morals of the individual throughout the country. The Mann Act is bad public policy, and, we believe, bad law. It is an excuse to local communities to shirk what they are responsible for in our system of government, and what they are best fitted to correct. It is one of the most conspicuous instances of the zeal of some reformers who, In their passionate confidence in the efficacy of legislating righteousness, see only one phase of a subject and strike at it, without considering what the real consequences will be. Point 61. The New York Times agreed. In an editorial entitled Uncle Sam, Blackmailer, it noted that only men bore the guilt of consensual interstate affairs, creating a situation that was particularly conducive to women blackmailing men. It argued that the Mann Act is, in itself, an absurdity, but that is less serious than its direct incitement to crime. 62. Within a few months, the Supreme Court responded to the blackmail question, but not with the revision to the Mann Act for which the Chicago Daily Tribune hoped. 61. 100. On February 1st, 1915, the Supreme Court announced its decision in the case of United States v. Holt. Clara Holt was a married 41-year-old who had engaged in an interstate affair with a 21-year-old man. The indictment alleged that the young man transported Clara for the purpose of illicit sexual intercourse, but also had an added component, a conspiracy charge against Clara for aiding in her own transportation, because she traveled with her lover of her own free will. Point 63. It was then left to the Supreme Court to decide whether or not a woman could conspire in a crime against herself. The law of conspiracy generally applies when two or more people make plans to break the law. This does not, however, apply in situations where the crime itself requires two participants. Legal historian David Langham uses the example of a duel. The crime itself must, by definition, involve two people, and therefore cannot be a conspiracy. A third person would have to be involved in the planning of the duel in order for a conspiracy to have occurred. Point 64. How then could one woman, violating the Mann Act with one man, be charged with conspiracy? 102. Victimization. 102. The Supreme Court found a convoluted way of justifying the decision to try female victims with conspiracy. The decision written by Justice Holmes argued that the crime could occur without a woman's consent if she were taken by force. Therefore, the crime did not necessarily have to involve two consenting persons, and if a woman did consent, it would then act as a third element and create a conspiracy. Point 65. This decision separated women's physical bodies from their will. In either scenario, the woman's body would be victimized, but in the latter case, she would have been complicit in that. 102. Victimization. In no scenario would the body cease to be victimized simply because the woman agreed with how her body was transported and treated. Although this decision meant that women's consent could be a criminal offense, it still did not take consent seriously enough to see it as a meaningful extension of an individual woman's right to determine where she would travel and with whom. Nevertheless, the same newspapers that had recently criticized the Mann Act issued editorials hailing the end of the blackmail problem. The New York Times rejoiced that the Supreme Court had again come to the rescue against the fanatical enforcement of a bungling law. 66. The Chicago Daily Tribune celebrated that the decision, in all likelihood, will end the use of the Mann White Slave Act, SIC, for purposes of blackmail. 67. The Holt decision did indeed cut down on the volume of cases of alleged blackmail, though some still occurred. Point 68. It also became a useful tool for prosecutors who wanted to threaten female victims and force them to testify against their male lovers. More significantly, the decision reinforced the idea that women could not make their own rational decisions about their bodies. The Holt decision meant that a woman could be put on trial for conspiring to victimize herself, while at the same time a man would be on trial for victimizing her. This refined the theme of victimization, but did not negate it. Rather than suggesting that no Mann Act violation had occurred in cases where the woman clearly consented to, or even instigated, the immoral purposes, the court's ruling firmly established that women were still subject to the coercion of men, even when. 66. A blow to blackmail. New York Times, February 4th, 1915. 103. Those women participated in their own victimization. Pamela Hogg's analysis of consent is particularly useful in understanding how the Supreme Court could envision a woman as simultaneously victim and conspirator. While allowing for the possibility of aggressively immoral women who would blackmail unsuspecting men, This ruling also maintained the idea that all women were necessarily victimized by all forms of illicit sex. The Holt decision reflected the idea that no sex worker could or would freely choose that business. It treats the woman who has been transported for use in the business of prostitution as victim, often a willing victim, but nevertheless a victim. 69. Relatively few cases of conspiracy were ever actually brought to trial, but the legal possibility remained to threaten women who came forward with allegations of Mann Act violations. Only 2 cases of conspiracy were brought before the Southern California District Court in the years before 1925, and in neither case was the woman convicted. For instance, because Charles Taylor and Genevieve Huffman Sargent traveled together in 1920 and occupied hotel rooms as man and wife, they were indicted on charges of conspiring to violate the Mann Act. The charges directed at Sargent accused her of knowingly procuring and obtaining tickets to be used by herself for immoral purposes. In a separate case, Charles Taylor was charged with an actual Mann Act violation, though both cases were eventually dismissed. 70, although women throughout the U.S. were on rare occasion actually convicted of conspiracy to 69, 100, violate the Mann Act, the threat of charges were much more commonly a tool of prosecutors, who would drop the charges once women agreed to act as cooperative witnesses. As David Langham notes, FBI agents received memos as late as 1949 saying that complaints were usually filed against victims charging conspiracy to keep them in custody, and that such charges should be dropped once women fulfilled their valuable roles as government witnesses. 71. The history of the Mann Act tends to be the story of the men with direct legal involvement in the cases, those who were the defendants, the prosecutors, the judges, and the lawmakers. However, by definition, every Mann Act prosecution had at its center a female victim. The wording of the law, together with the decisions of judges and the actions of the women themselves, shaped the meanings of victimization for the various individuals involved. Some saw themselves as victims, some did not, and others were defined as both victims and victimizers of themselves by the legal system. By operating within, and sometimes pushing at, the boundaries of the Mann Act, many women successfully turned this law into a tool for their defense, while at the same time reinforced its overall premise about the ways in which men victimized women. Examining the actual experiences of the women who found themselves caught up in Mann Act cases provides a working-class response to the elite social reformers who had so much rhetorical power over the definition of victim. The experiences of the women in Mann Act cases represent a microcosm of the greater class, gender, and generational struggles of the 1910s and 1920s, as young women sought a new level of economic and 100 sexual freedom, while at the same time the middle class sought to maintain its gendered standards of sexual and social respectability. The ways in which the Mann Act was enforced created a location for both assent and dissent about the meanings of appropriate feminine and masculine behavior, a public venue for debating the meanings of private actions.